New details are emerging about how a U.S. political fundraiser helped orchestrate a campaign against Qatar in Washington, D.C. Elliot Broidy was one of U.S. President Donald Trump's top fundraisers. Broidy is accused of illegally running a multimillion-dollar advocacy campaign to turn the U.S. against Qatar. The campaign was allegedly funded by the United Arab Emirates. Now, a key date in that investigation, according to the New York Times, is a pivotal White House meeting with President Donald Trump, his chief of staff, and his national security advisor. Elliot Broidy reportedly told an associate that he spent most of that meeting talking about the Middle East, including telling President Trump that Qatar was part of an axis of evil. Let's talk about this with Rami Khouri. He's a senior public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut. Good to have you with us again on the Al Jazeera NewsHour. So we know that Elliot Broidy is already under federal investigation into violations of lobbying laws, and his arrangements with the governments of certain countries, particularly the UAE, is of interest to prosecutors. But I suppose the question is, are we now getting a sense of the full scope and intensity of Broidy's activities?
We're getting a lot more details about either things that he's been indicted for by a court in New York for bribing the New York State Pension Fund, or he paid off an ex-Playboy bunny $1.5 million to keep her quiet because they had an affair. Or we're hearing a lot more about questionable links between him, a fellow called George Nader, and the UAE government. And what you're seeing here is an extraordinarily fascinating but real picture of the combination of incompetence, criminality, shady dealings, and pretty ineffective work by some of the people who are very close to Trump, with close links to the United Arab Emirates and in some cases with the Saudis and others. And this is an extraordinary insight into this pattern of conduct and the links back to the UAE. And most of the things that the UAE tried to get him to do have failed, like most of the foreign policy initiatives that the UAE has taken in the region have not worked very well. So that's what makes this so interesting.
One takeaway from the New York Times piece is that donations to think tanks as well as nonprofit organizations really helped drive the anti-Qatar campaign in Washington, D.C. But is it possible to assess at all the exact impact that Broidy's anti-Qatar campaign has had on the country?
We can say for sure that it was able to generate some speeches, some op-eds. For instance, he paid something like $240,000 to an American company that dealt with influencing the media, that paid columnists and influential people to write things. We can calculate the events that took place because he paid the money. A conference by the Hudson Institute or the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. It's hard to calculate the actual impact. The reality, though, today, if you look at the UAE and you look at Qatar, in Washington and in the American political elite, the Qataris are doing fine. They're not the terrorist-supporting wild Islamists that the Saudis and Emiratis have tried to paint them as, while the Emiratis and the Saudis are really in a difficult situation in the U.S. with congressional majority votes to prohibit arms sales to them and things like that, because of the Khashoggi killing, because of the lobbying they're doing, because of the boycott of Qatar and other things that they've done. So the bottom line, I think, is that the Emiratis have not achieved anything by dealing with shady characters. Half of the people that they dealt with in the Trump administration or around them, like Paul Manafort and Nader and these guys, some of them are convicted sex offenders.
Yeah, so what position?
Some of them are convicted.
What sort of position does this put the UAE in? Because, as we're saying, federal prosecutors are looking into Broidy as well as his links to the United Arab Emirates. But we know, of course, the UAE was also mentioned in Robert Mueller's report. So what impact does all of this have on the Emirates?
What it does is it creates more interest in various either prosecutional offices in the U.S. or congressional committees or the media now to investigate more closely what actually are these countries doing in the U.S. And some of them will be investigating Qatar, which is fair enough. if people do basic lobbying, you hire a lobbying company, you pay them money, they register as an agent for a foreign government. That's perfectly legitimate. Everybody does it. Qatar, the UAE, Egypt, every country does that. But what these cases are pointing out is shady dealings with money that's not declared, with people like Broidy doing things and not registering as foreign agents. And that's why they're being investigated now. So it's going to shed more light through serious investigations on what the UAE or the Saudis or even the Qataris are doing in the United States. I don't think the Qataris have much to worry about, as far as we can tell, while some of the other countries have more serious issues that they have to deal with. It's really the low quality of the people that they've been dealing with that is the biggest telltale sign of the ineffective nature of these kinds of campaigns.
All right, Rami Khouri, we thank you for speaking to us from Beirut.